All right. Good afternoon. And if you're watching from outside a Central European time zone, possibly good morning or maybe even good evening or good night. My name is Christian Pierce, and I'm a program manager at the Competence Center for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of St. Gallen. And welcome to Deep Dives with the CCDI. Deep Dives are online sessions offered by the Competence Center for Diversity and Inclusion. And the online sessions often focus on topics from a DE&I perspective with a bit of a Swiss context, but oftentimes we get into a global discussion as well. Today's talk continues the themes that we discussed in last year's deep dives. We started with a series focused on race and ethnicity in Switzerland. We had some phenomenal speakers like Yvonne Apio-Brando-Amolo, Hans Fassler, Jacqueline Tosukpe, Benjamin Huteroth, and Dominique Day. And we really focused on the issues going on in Switzerland. Now, for 2023, we're tackling what we've kind of considered behind the scenes the isms: tokenism, saviorism, and colorism. And I got to be real with you. It sucks to be a token. It sucks to deal with colorism, which is slightly different from racism, but there's some overlap. And then as well, it's a terrible situation when you're dealing with saviorism. So we're jumping into these topics this year in order to really create awareness, but ultimately drive from that awareness to action. Because once you're empowered with information, you can no longer claim ignorance. You go from being ignorant to, if you don't act on that information, negligent. Now, with that said, there are a couple things I want to mention during the introduction. First, Dr. Noemi Michel. If you've not read or looked up any of her research, after today's talk, do so. And I mention her not just because of everything she's done, which is phenomenal in creating more discourses here in Switzerland from an intersectional perspective, but also because of her talk last year during St. Gallen's Diversity and Inclusion Week, which was titled Understanding Racial Burden in Tokenism, a Black feminist critique of Black invisibility in higher education. So after today's talk, if you're looking to understand more, I highly recommend that. Another resource I highly recommend is an eye-opening article from a personal perspective, and that was written on Medium by Ramesh Nagaraja on his personal experiences dealing with tokenism. So once again, that can give you an added perspective for what those of us who deal with tokenism go through. Now, today, the format is going to be, the introduction going on right now. I'm going to talk, but I don't want to talk a lot. I want to talk about some of the key things we need to cover in order to start getting actions and initiatives that are more profound in organizations to overcome tokenism. Now, with that said, after I'm done talking, I don't want it to just be a monologue. Let's have a dialogue. So with that said, feel free at any time to comment or question in the chat. However, I'll only address the comments and questions once I'm done with my piece. Now, with that said, if you're listening, I'm going to make a general assumption that you are probably a human being. And if you're a human being, you deserve to live a life of respect and dignity and the reciprocation of such. So with that said, I do ask that you show me the same respect and dignity that I'm going to show you through today's talk. Today, we're going to cover tokenism, but we're going to get into exactly what is tokenism. It's not tokenization. We aren't talking about non-fungible tokens or cryptocurrencies. So if you're here for that, please stay on to listen, but then go look for other resources for NFTs. And disclaimer, I am in no way, shape, or form giving any advice on those. We're talking about tokenism. So we're going to cover exactly what tokenism is and why organizations may choose to knowingly or unknowingly engage in tokenism. We'll cover some examples of tokenism from an organizational perspective that often we see in our work occurs to individuals. Maybe later on, if you ask, I'll get into some personal examples, but not so much during then. Some negative effects of tokenism. And then we're going to talk about when people might want to be tokens, when they're willing tokens versus unwilling tokens, and how we can avoid tokenism in the workplace. And then just a few organizational goals that can ultimately start you on the journey or continue the journey to help nullify tokenism. So, tokenism. When we start with this discussion for today, I want to anchor it in a point in time from 1963. So we often tell the companies we work with or our students that when you're looking to overcome these inequities, it's important to understand what occurred in the past to know how we got to the present in order to make for a better future. So let's jump into the past. 1963, Malcolm X is at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. Now at the time, Brown versus the Board of Education had just occurred in the United States. Desegregation was going on. You started to have schools who were starting to integrate Black students and other students of color in with traditionally white public schools. So many people thought that this was a good thing. And perceivably, I would say it's a great thing. I wouldn't have been able to get my education had this not occurred. But Malcolm X was not content. So to the African Students Association and the NAACP campus chapter at Michigan State University, he gave a talk and he called it the race problem. And during that talk, he brought up tokenism specifically. And he said, tokenism is hypocrisy. One little student in the University of Mississippi, that's hypocrisy. A handful of students in Little Rock, Arkansas, is hypocrisy. A couple of students going to a school in Georgia is hypocrisy. Integration in America is hypocrisy in the rawest form. And the whole world can see it. All this little tokenism that's dangled in front of the Negro, and then he's told, see what we're doing for you, Tom? Why, the whole world can see that this is nothing but hypocrisy. All you do is make your image worse. You don't make it better. Now, with that said, let's talk about tokenism. So, why does tokenism, going in with Malcolm X's words, make an organization's image worse and not better? Well, that's because tokenism is a way of using diversity dimensions such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, disability, and neurodiversity, or even an intersection of such dimensions to make an organization look progressive while it's still maintaining the structures and processes that marginalize people from those underrepresented groups. So we're going to talk about it a bit more later, but it's important to note that tokenism can have negative effects on both the organization and the individuals in those organizations. It can lead to lack of belonging and feelings of isolation and exclusion, and it creates that false sense, this facade of progress towards diversity, equity, and inclusion while masking deeper issues of systemic inequality. Hence why Malcolm X deemed it a hypocrisy. And though it may be hypocritical for organizations to engage in tokenism, why might an organization want to embrace tokens? Well, we already talked a bit about one reason. I mean, that's to give the facade or the appearance of diversity without actually making any meaningful changes or any profound, I like the word profound, any profound changes to the organization's practices that would otherwise help members of the group that is being used as a token succeed in the workplace unhindered. Another reason, like we saw after George Floyd's murder in 2020, is to avoid criticism or negative attention from the public or media. So academic Erica George used the term Black Lives Matter marketing, and that really kind of showed how organizations put out statements on, at the time it was Twitter, I guess now you can call it X, on Instagram, on Facebook, through their official channels and emails saying, you know, we stand against racial injustices. We are here to support our Black employees or our other employees of color in order to overcome these systemic injustices. They said things, but behind the scenes, as we've seen through research, there wasn't really the action behind it. So they were able to avoid that pressure or that public condemnation through pretty performative statements without actually doing anything. Tokenism can also be used, you know, not necessarily to even show that there's fake progression or more equality, but just as a way to absolutely maintain the status quo. You know, here in Switzerland, at the federal level, there's no statistics, because it's not allowed to be taken on race or ethnic identity. And so because of that, it's hard in comparison to a country like the United States or like Brazil to start to understand what might be a representative makeup of people from the dimensions of race and ethnicity in an organization. So because of that, tokenism might even be used to maintain the status quo, because you hire a few qualified Black people or people of color and you say, hey, we're good, we are diverse because we have a few people. And because there's no data, we aren't sure how many others we need to bring in, but we're good. We've got one or two or three, so we can continue on with what we're doing. And as I said, you know, this is talking about both individuals and organizations. There is an exclusionary culture that can be created in an organization while trying to maintain the status quo. So even though the organization thinks it's a great thing, even unwillingly, sometimes willingly, and we can talk about, you know, the size of the organization and their incentive to do so later on, but it creates that culture of exclusion, which then ostracizes the same people who are often being used as tokens. So when you start looking at some examples of tokenism in organizations, as I said, you know, maintaining that status quo, especially when you're able to circumvent data or you don't have data. It might be hiring a person, a single person even, from an underrepresented group to give the appearance of diversity, but at the same time, not making any changes to the organization's practices that actually allow more people from that underrepresented group to have access to opportunities in that organization. And even for that single person or a group of people who are brought in as tokens, giving them the ability to rise in the organization or the talent development pipeline for them to be able to rise as a leader. You know, an example might be bringing in somebody into a non-management position and then just keeping them there as, you know, like a specialist or saying, well, they're doing a good enough job, and not really giving them the opportunities to rise, but then using them on posters or advertisement or communication and showing that the organization is diverse. Another example is going in line with that, like in communications, using marginalized people specifically in advertisements to give the impression that the company embraces diversity, even though it's not even woven into the fabric of the company's culture, or there's no true DE&I statement. And when we say DE&I, we mean diversity, equity, and inclusion, the intertwining of those. And so customers see an external facade and think that the brand or the organization is really showing themselves as something that they aren't. So there was an example where one Swiss company, which has made multiple mistakes over the years when it comes to this topic, was trying to show how diverse their employees were. So they had like a statement in the middle and pictures of all these employees around the statement. Well, there was only one person of color in that out of this whole diverse mosaic. And that person was a Black man wearing a pretty negatively stereotypical cook uniform. And so you see a decision behind this where they tried to use this person as a token and show that they were diverse or progressive, but actually they kind of outed themselves in the way that they perceive or treat employees of color or Black employees in that organization. You know, another thing that we've talked about externally to an organization, but let's kind of get to internal. Another thing that can really occur is, as an example, you hire people from an underrepresented or traditionally marginalized group, and then you expect them to represent that whole group. Like you bring in one person from the LGBTQ plus community, and maybe they're gay, but you expect them to know the experiences and the nuances of what it's like to be a trans person or bisexual or lesbian. That's tokenism right there. And then as well, going back to what I was talking about during the Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd, one of the biggest examples of tokenism as well is creating policies or commitments on paper towards marginalized or underrepresented groups, and then never actually executing or implementing an action behind that. So being, once again, performative rather than profound. Oh, sorry. I'm just thinking about some of the times where I've been stuck as a token in other places around the world as well. And it's not comfortable for the individual, for the people around, and for the organization. Now, as I reflect on my own experiences, let's talk about the negative effects of tokenism. So I talked about that culture of exclusion that may come in an organization because of it, but there's an isolation, or one of my favorite words in English to say is an ostracization of people from the rest of the group. So creating an outgroup or an othering, while the in-group or the mainly homogenous group or the privileged group is able to still go on with their processes unhindered. As I said as well, pressure to represent the entire group that you identify with. The pressure, if you're a woman in an organization and the organization is trying to use you as a token, the pressure to represent all women, the pressure to represent all Black people, the pressure to represent all Turkish people, the pressure to represent all Muslims, the pressure to represent all Jewish people, this pressure creates a weight that can oftentimes cause extremely detrimental issues to an employee's mental health. And with that pressure to kind of represent that entire group, there's, as I said, that detrimental impact on the mental health. And there's also the stress that comes from being put on that pedestal while still being discriminated against for being a member of that group. In my classes, I often talk about W.B. Du Bois' double consciousness and that feeling of two-ness that he describes often, where you know how you want to be seen, you know how you're seen externally, you know you want to help try and make a change in the organization, but you're still dealing with this discrimination at the same time. And so as Du Bois says, like, it feels like his soul, like these two parts are almost being torn asunder. There's a stress that comes from that it can be unbearable, especially when you combine it with that pressure and that feeling of isolation or exclusion. And those things are really heavy. In addition to that as well, when you start looking at recruiting or even some of the more current conversations that have occurred across organizations where people are worried about identity politics, or this term that has kind of come around in the past couple of years, woke capitalism, where people are almost gaslit because they aren't sure whether they were hired because of their skills or abilities or just because the organization needs that diversity hire or needs to create a more heterogeneous group. So it's really important to understand the negative effects that can occur. And also note that some of this negativity can come from that general lack of authenticity from an organization. So when we talk about the organizational level, I was focusing a lot on the individual, but from an organizational level, that lack of authenticity when it comes to using tokens can lead to a lack of credibility, which can not only hurt, obviously, employees internally, but lead to a loss of customers, clients, employees obviously leaving, or even future employees. When they know that your organization isn't really committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and just looking to get some good press in the short term and not even make any changes. With this discussion and what I just said about, you know, people looking to enter into an organization, talking about like new recruits or even sometimes junior employees, let's talk about willing versus unwilling tokens. Because some people might consciously want to be a token. Many others, especially given the negative effects that we talked about, oftentimes unwilling tokens. But why might someone want to be a willing token? Why might they enter into an organization and want to be that token employee? Well, some people may choose to do so because they believe that being that token will help them advance in their career or gain access to opportunities that they might not have if they weren't a token. Others may take on the responsibility or feel they have to take on the responsibility of representing that identity that they come from. And in doing so, try and push through the organization. Now, with that latter example as well, there may be those of us who choose to be tokens for a positive reason, that they feel that they can enter into an organization as a token, and through that, they can start to make profound change. While that is possible, what we oftentimes see is that, as we said before, that pressure can create an unbearable weight. So it's usually not an individual. It takes a community in order to help create this organizational change. But let's talk about the willing versus unwillingness from a slightly different perspective. So when we have a willing token, a person who wants to willingly go into a company, be the token because they think it's going to help them climb the ladder, there's a self-distancing that they oftentimes create from other members of the group that they are part of. And what you see is a pro-self mentality or approach. While someone who may go in as a former military officer, I oftentimes like to think of the phrase tip of the spear, but someone who goes in and wants to be the willing token in order to bring more people in order to really create that profound change by creating a community, is looking at it from a pro-social mentality. So when we look at this approach, we often encourage people to get to focusing on a pro-social approach versus pro-self. Because when everyone's starting to think selflessly, that's when we can see real change. Now, as I start to get to the concluding points, how can we start to really avoid tokenism in the workplace? But first, as we often say at the CCDI, is through inclusive leadership. So that's taking inclusion, that ability to value and include others as unique individuals who have valid experiences and deserve to be heard, and create that sense of belonging, and pair that with being a leader. I heard once that being a leader is just being stuck as an imperfect person trying to get other imperfect people to follow. I don't necessarily agree with that. Although we are imperfect, it's creating the motivation and care to drive and inspire others. So combining inclusion with leadership. And then getting past, so that was point number one. Point number two, getting past performative diversity. If you're looking at your company and you start seeing the organizational values or the culture, and diversity is just thrown out as a buzzword, as oftentimes we see here, there may be an issue. In order to start getting past that buzzword of diversity and going from a performative stance to a more profound stance, you have to tie diversity in with inclusion. So going back to inclusive leadership as well, but tie diversity in with inclusion. And then furthermore, intertwine it with equity. Some people as well are also saying you need to explicitly state belonging, making the acronym diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I'm a fan of whatever allows people to perform unhindered without discrimination and feel included in the organization. So if you want to throw in belonging as an official acronym or not, that's up to you. Now, when we create that culture through inclusive leadership and start looking at the employees themselves and how you can start to overcome any tokenism traps, allow employees a profound voice and the ability to have a part in the decisions that are made, especially those that are impacting them. So larger companies often implement employee resource groups or have a diversity advisory board. Or even we look at things like reverse mentorship programs as well, so that employees from traditionally marginalized or underrepresented backgrounds are able to have that voice and that say and know that the organization takes them seriously. Now, one quick note about employee resource groups. They should not be exclusive to the groups that people identify with. Allies should be included, and it should be done in a way that doesn't put pressure specifically on the ERG or the burden on the ERG to make changes for that group, but ultimately allows and empowers the ERG to help inspire change throughout the organization. With that as well, and we've talked about it a bit, but especially at the individual level, please don't make people feel excluded or feel like tokens by just expecting them to be the spokesperson or the subject matter expert for their community. Take the time to learn with them, to understand where they're coming from as an individual. Yes, they might identify with that community, but that doesn't mean they're representative of every single person from that community. So take the time to get to know them and to learn with them and grow on this journey. If you want to learn, let's say, for example, you want to learn more about the African diaspora, don't put the onus on every Black person you meet to educate you. You're listening to a deep dive today, for example. If you took the initiative on your own, that's awesome. It's things like this, getting out and starting to read, listen to podcasts, listen to, some of the great talks that are on YouTube from phenomenal academics like Bell Hooks or Kimberly Crenshaw or Robert Livingston. Get out there and take some responsibility to learn on your own, but also support the communities that you're looking to learn about. And through that, start to build on that knowledge sharing. And, the last thing when we look at this is not following Milton Friedman so much. I think that's the easiest way to say it. But what I mean by that is don't fake your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts for the sake of profit. Yes, research shows that organizations that have greater diversity and can manage that diversity financially perform better. But what is more important than performing better is to allow each and every individual in your organization to live a life of respect and dignity and nullify the discrimination they may face, which includes tokenism. So when we look at how we can avoid tokenism, one of the things that you see in a lot of research is creating greater representation. So I've seen ranges from 15 to 30%. If you look at the representation needed for women to overcome tokenism in the workplace, depending on the country, organization, and context, excuse me. But when you look at just increasing representation, that may not nullify tokenism. You need to pair the increase of representation with inclusive and equitable policies and initiatives, because ultimately what you want is to create inclusion rather than exclusion or assimilation into your organization. And what you get through that representation, especially as we start to overcome things like the gender wage gap or create more equitable leadership or talent development pipelines, and let's say, we have more women CEOs, you start creating a normalization for people. And through that normalization, you are able to help nullify that tokenism. Another thing that you can do, which we are able to kind of see through the gender intelligence report that we have paired with the organization in advance is look at like recruitment, like new hires and promotion figures. Tracking who gets hired in your organization and who is promoted, especially from those who might be working part-time versus full-time, is a great way to identify areas that you need to improve and understand who from what underrepresented groups may be able to currently access or climb the corporate ladder and those who aren't. And when you're able to see who's not able to do so, you can identify the root causes and start changing those processes or creating policies and initiatives in place that allow people to do that. Another thing, excuse me quickly. Thanks. Another thing that I'm a fan of, employee engagement surveys to measure employees' mental health, their well-being, their feeling of belonging in the workplace, their sense of inclusion. Starting to have those anonymously can really get that feedback. A couple other things you can do. Focus groups. You're able to get and capture, sometimes that's done through an external researcher as well. That way people feel a bit more comfortable to speak, but you're able to capture how people are feeling. Reverse mentorship, as I mentioned earlier, is another way that senior leaders, once they get to know their mentor, who's oftentimes a junior employee from an underrepresented group, to have more personal conversations and really understand what is going on. And then the last thing, when you're trying to understand how your employees are thinking, are exit interviews. Start to capture why people are leaving. Are there issues of discrimination or things like tokenism that are causing people to leave? Was someone used as a token in your organization and they aren't able to see themselves at the top, or they feel so ostracized that they need to leave and find an organization that has a greater sense of belonging or even a greater community for them? So with that, you can look at retention rates as well with the exit interviews. And that's also data dependent, depending on what you're able to measure, because when you're able to measure through data, it's often, pun intended, better to quantify why changes need to be made. A couple other things are your DE&I training efforts. A lot of organizations, especially in Switzerland, are a bit new to the journey of tackling intersectional topics or multiple dimensions of diversity. So it's important to keep up a sustained training effort to educate your employees so that they understand when they might be hiring people who are from underrepresented backgrounds that are basically the first person to that organization, what they can do to make that person feel welcome and to make them feel like part of the group while still valuing their own uniqueness in a way that doesn't put pressure or onus on them to represent their community or make them feel like a subject matter expert for their community. And with that, this is always reiterative. At the CCDI, we have our DE&I journey, and it almost looks like design thinking. And if you're a fan of design thinking, you know that you might go in order the first time, but then you might jump around or just reiterate the process to see what you can do to consistently improve. So with that said, I would like to conclude my piece by saying thank you very much for listening today. And I would like to open it to any questions, comments, or thoughts that you may have. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much. So I'll read this comment for those of you who might not be able to see it at the moment. I found the argument quite powerful. A genuine willingness to be a token can begin with experiencing feelings of exclusion and, in doing so, contribute to the creation of a more inclusive workplace in the long term. This highlights the dual sources of change: inclusive leadership from the top and active engagement from employees at all levels can collectively drive transformation. All right. Well, I currently am not seeing any other comments or questions at this point. I really appreciate you all listening in. And I would like just to reiterate, for any other resources, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. You can email me, christian.pierce@unisg.ch. Feel free to check out our online resources through the online sessions at ccdi-unisg.ch as well. And quick switch up, I'm just going to answer this question quickly. Do you think tokenism happens by design or is unconscious? Great question. Sometimes it's both. It's really dependent. There may be organizations, as we saw in 2020, who just scrambled to start hiring Black people because they were like, oh, we need to do something to show that we're trying to support the community. And so they kind of become reactive rather than proactive. And being reactive and consciously doing that, they aren't able to actually create profound change. And what we saw too, as well, a lot of organizations jumped on to the title of creating a chief diversity officer. And the average tenure, now that we've had a couple of years to look, the average tenure of those chief diversity officers was 18 months because organizations often didn't know how to properly utilize them, or even though it was supposed to be a senior level position, group them or umbrella them directly under HR. So in certain cases, it can happen by design. In other times or other organizations, it may be unconscious, where people genuinely hire someone because of their qualifications, and they may be the first person from an underrepresented community in that organization, and the organization just doesn't know how to necessarily handle them. And so, it's well-intentioned, but people might put that pressure on that person to represent their whole community or be a subject matter expert and keep going to them. And what really matters is creating the inclusive environment so that that person can have the psychological safety to speak up and say, hey, I feel like a token. Let's, change this, and use things like nonviolent communication in order to identify issues. Now, if they don't have the psychological safety in that organization, unfortunately, that's where we see these employees tend to leave and find other organizations. Now, with that said, I think that brings us to the end of today. It is 12:59, and I want to be pretty prompt. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for what you're doing to make the world a better place. And remember to take awareness and change that to action. Now, we will be back here with our second deep dive of this year, Saviorism, on November 15th at 12:15. If you haven't already done so, you can go ahead and sign up on LinkedIn, or you can watch it on YouTube. I'm Christian Pierce from the CCDI. I just want to say thanks again. Have an amazing day and keep being you because you are awesome. Thanks again. Bye.